Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking once again with Laurence Halsted. Laurence, welcome back.
Hi Dan, lovely to be here again.
Yeah, super excited to have you back on. Why don't we start by getting you to reintroduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I was a fencer, a professional fencer in my first life, and competed for Team GB in the London and Rio Olympics. In between those, I moved to Denmark, and as soon as I hung up my swords in 2016, I became the performance director for the Danish Fencing Federation, which I still am. And around the same time, I also started working for this wonderful charity called the True Athlete Project, where I'm the director of the mentoring program. We have an athlete mentoring program which matches elite Paralympic, Olympic athletes with young aspiring athletes, and we lead them through a kind of wonderful year-long program. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
And we spoke almost when the Sports Psych Show was in its infancy. I mean, I think
Episode 8.
It was episode 8, was it? Wow.
Yeah, top 10 or first 10.
First, and probably a top 10 listen to, Lawrence. I mean, it was such a great conversation, and actually so much of what we spoke about, I'm sure, influenced what we're going to talk about probably in greater depth today, because you've written a book. You mentioned there the project you're involved with, True Athlete Project, and in line with that, the book is entitled Becoming a True Athlete, A Practical Philosophy for Flourishing Through Sport. And it's a fantastic book. I'm looking forward to working my way through it with you today and taking out some of the main points. But I suppose, why don't we start with you sort of giving a quick overview of the book and then telling us a bit about the beginnings of its content. You know, what have you written and why have you written what you've written?
Yeah, well, I have to say, to start with, I have gotten so much value out of your podcast, Dan, and that is reflected in this book. You'll notice there's so many of your past guests that I've drawn on, I've spoken to, I've even worked with some of them. So your podcast has a heavy fingerprint on the book. So the book was kind of the original idea was almost as a manifesto for the vision, the approach we have in the True Athlete Project. We think we have quite a unique approach to sport, and especially the kind of journey of athletes' development. And it just so happened last year, kind of during the lockdown, that I got this opportunity to start working on it, and I got to put it into this current format. I guess the place to start is that we believe in the True Athlete Project that sport is an incredible vehicle for doing amazing things in society, both for the individuals, the participants, but also for society itself. But it's failing on so many accounts to live up to that potential. And the reason for that, there are potentially many reasons, but it's kind of lost track of its real meaning, its true values, and being led astray by this kind of win at all costs approach, a business model approach. And you see, I mean, what we think is missing is that there's this lacking underlying philosophy to why we're doing it all. And you see that some of the Eastern martial arts have very clear founding philosophies. Their founders built these kind of sports on top of quite lofty goals and philosophies. But that's completely missing from all of the Western and modern sport, the rest of the sports that we see. So this book was some kind of moved from being a manifesto of our approach to kind of and offering a suggestion of what this kind of underlying philosophy could be for all of sport, some unifying philosophy. So it's pretty grand. And we've been working with coaches and athletes and kind of leaders in sports organizations, clubs, schools, NGBs, and building up this approach, which is all kind of aimed at creating a more compassionate culture of sport and a more compassionate culture through sport. Kind of harking back to that idea that sport can have a tremendous influence on on society, a tremendous contribution. And that coaches, for example, are amazing social change makers. And if we recognize that and help develop the coaches alongside it, that's the key part of it. So yeah, that's the kind of the origin story of it, and then I can get into a little bit about the structure of the book if you like.
Yeah, brilliant.
So I was inspired by Stoicism as a practical philosophy. And in Stoicism, you have a higher purpose of living, and you have these virtues of Stoicism, specific virtues of Stoicism, and then you have quite a number of mental, emotional strategies for kind of living out those virtues. So that's basically how I set up the book. We have a higher purpose of sport. In our philosophy, the higher purpose of sport is to create a more compassionate, vibrant, and peaceful world. And to do that, the idea is that we could create these true athletes. We develop a generation or generations of true athletes, and there's a description of what they are. And then the kind of the bulk of the book is around the four virtues of the true athlete, which is around integrity and responsibility and compassion and awareness. And then the third part, which is the really kind of where the rubber hits the road, is a set of mental emotional strategies which can form a kind of training program for an athlete, or just things they can integrate, they can practice, they can integrate into their daily lives that can help underpin those virtues and help them become a true athlete.
It's really interesting, Laurence, because as you've mentioned there, you open the book introducing the true athlete philosophy, and when we use this word philosophy, obviously it's usually attributed to coaching, a coach's philosophy, but this, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this feels more like a philosophy for participation, more so than a coaching philosophy or a playing philosophy as such.
Yeah, definitely. It's a philosophy for being an athlete in all of its kind of connotations. So it certainly encroaches into performance and how you want to turn up as a performer, but also in all of those aspects that around the sport itself, off the field of play, what kind of teammate you want to be, what kind of leader you want to be. It's an acknowledgement that to be an athlete is a holistic endeavor, that you are not just an athlete, you are a person with all the kind of mental, emotional, social kind of elements kind of wrapped up in that. And so your philosophy should touch on and should approach all of those aspects to be kind of to have integrity and to really have power.
The book is split into three parts. Part number one, introducing the true athlete philosophy. Part two, the virtues of the true athlete philosophy. And then part three, as you mentioned, the mental and emotional strategies and practices for cultivating the true athlete virtues. Honing in on this philosophy, you've mentioned some words. You haven't mentioned winning or high performance. I mean, I'm assuming the reader isn't going to be confronted with those words at the beginning of this book in part one, that isn't a part of what you're suggesting a philosophy should be, or can those things be a part of this?
Absolutely, high performance should be a part of it, but we envisage high performance as being a holistic thing. So it's not just about the ranking and the medals that you've achieved. And in fact, that's kind of a key part of this, is that, and highlight in the book some of these examples of athletes who have made it the absolute top of their sport, but have been left kind of empty and bereft of all meaning as soon as kind of straight afterwards. So the idea is that's not enough. We know that now. We know that just simply being the best athlete, the best performer, is not enough for living a fulfilled life. And actually, that's one of the lies that sport culture teaches us. And kids are learning that if you win that competition, if you are world number one, you'll be happy, you'll be fulfilled. It's just not the case. I mean, so many of those top athletes who have shown us that isn't the case. So in order to be a true high performer, we propose that you need to do all of those things that make you a kind of great athlete, but adding in some of these other elements that might that often is missing from a traditional athlete development. And that's what the four virtues are. They're kind of virtues or values, you could call them, or traits that aren't necessarily, they're not essential to making it to the top of your sport, but they're essential to living a kind of fulfilled and meaningful life. And importantly, they can also have direct impact, kind of positive impact on performance. So we absolutely include. We're not shying away from that. Sport is about elite sport, especially is about doing your best and winning and trying to get as high as possible. But we're just pointing at these other things that we think are kind of overlooked and for various reasons overlooked, which is creating immense damage in these environments, but also is limiting people's kind of potential in their sport. And when we talk about those kind of true winning mindsets and kind of all out ambitious kind of to be the best athlete, that's the reason we have these kind of horrific abuse cases coming out of gymnastics and swimming and cycling, and I mean all over the place, these high performance cultures in quotation marks, because they're absolutely not. They're destroying people emotionally, and that can't be called high performance, even though they're winning gold medals.
So it's not so much that you're suggesting that high performance is a dirty word or a dirty term. It's that you're suggesting that we need to either redefine or broaden the definition of high performance.
Absolutely, I think we're actually not getting to our potential of the winning part either, because of this, because we're missing some of these other elements. I mean, that the greatest power in kind of human motivation and determination comes when a person is whole and feels kind of at ease and kind of in harmony with what they're doing. So if you're breaking somebody down in order to make them a better athlete, you're losing potential at the same time. And so it's not just a case of, oh, remember, we need to do this in a healthy way. It's that doing it with kind of well-being and mental health in mind, I think is going to break the next frontier of records and medals and performances.
And you're suggesting in this book that you can accomplish, you can achieve, you can potentially reach high performance or find high performance consistently in a manner that still retains a sense of well-being, that still considers mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the one side, I don't think we have a choice. We have a responsibility as leaders in sport, as coaches, to make the environments we're in charge of healthy insofar as it can. I understand that elite sport is not healthy in all aspects, but to make it as kind of to set up environments where the participants thrive in them, flourish in them. So I don't think we have a choice. I think we absolutely have to do that. But as I was saying before, I think it also will lead to greater performance benefits when we have those environments, when the human is flourishing, when the person is flourishing, the performances will be set free. And I have some very powerful kind of personal experiences from my own time at kind of the top level of sport and through the Olympics that kind of shows that really up close and personal for myself.
You mentioned there that perhaps one must accept, or we might accept, that not all elements, not all experiences within elite sport can be healthy, if that's the right term. I mean, as you mentioned there, you've been to Olympic Games. Your book is littered with fantastic graphic stories, anecdotes from champions, high performing individuals, high profile individuals who resonate with the viewpoint that, I've achieved, but I haven't necessarily achieved in a fully rounded way. I mean, when you say you accept that elite sport doesn't always come loaded with healthy experiences, I mean, what are those exceptions for you, Laurence?
Well, for a start, the physical load, the physical toll that many athletes go through breaks
Yep.
down the body. So endurance athletes and kind of weight bearing athletes are, their bodies, you have to suffer through a lot
Yeah.
to get anywhere in the sport. So it's not particularly healthy. It's at the extreme end of what's possible. So that's always going to be kind of an element of unhealthiness. And you also have to sacrifice a lot in to do your sport, to spend so much time doing it. So that in itself is not leading to a fully balanced kind of rounded lifestyle. Although one of the points that we make in the book is that athletes need to be aware of having some rounded identity, that they're not entirely exclusively wrapped up in their athletic identity. Um, uh, but yeah, those are two examples of how it pushes to the edges of what is healthy and past it. But and I'm certainly not suggesting that we pull right back from that and have everybody wonderfully kind of healthy and happy all the way through, because that wouldn't be elite sport.
There has to be some sacrifice. And so I'm assuming what you would argue would be all the more reason to have the philosophies, tools, techniques, approaches that you promote within the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing what happens without those. We're seeing what happens in these environments that run rampant without a kind of vision or a philosophy for what it should be, or why are we doing this? I mean, those coaches who can bully and abuse their athletes in order to get the medal, which ends up not being meaningful for their athlete. I mean, it's kind of it's grotesque, really. I mean, you have athletes saying they would give up their medal to have those years back of their lives. I mean, Olympic medals. We're talking about the top level athletes who'd say that medal wasn't worth it. We really have to come back to the question of meaning. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing elite sport? Our kind of answer to that is that it can be just incredibly powerful. And I also kind of bring up the examples of where those role models, those kind of examples in elite sport, like of the positive examples of athletes kind of living their best selves and doing it in harmony with themselves, can have such a profound impact on society and those around them. So it's taking the lessons that we learn from those kind of role models, those examples, and trying to bring them to the rest of sport.
Let's start to examine those tools, techniques, philosophies, approaches in slightly more granular detail. Part 2, the virtues of the true athlete philosophy. You introduce the reader to these virtues. Why don't you take us through what some of these virtues are, and then we can pick one to look a little bit more in depth into.
Yeah, sure. So the one that the virtue that tends to resonate most with athletes when they kind of come across it is around compassion, and especially self-compassion. And it's something
Okay.
that I think it seems to be countercultural. It seems to be against the kind of traditional ideas that athletes get, which is why when they read it, they've told me about this kind of breathing a sigh of relief, like, oh, it doesn't have to be like, I don't have to be brutal on myself, which is exactly the experience I had when I kind of first came round to this new approach of the self-compassionate approach versus the self-critical approach. So I was that kind of athlete. Maybe I talked about this in the episode we talked a while back, Dan, but I was that kind of athlete that was incredibly harsh on myself when I lost, and was in tears kind of after every tournament, and really felt like I should feel like that. Like I should feel devastated if I lost, regardless of how I performed. Just if I lost, it was terrible, and that was kind of a sign that I cared about it and that I would do everything possible to improve afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I went years, into my mid-20s as a professional national level athlete, believing that, until I got this new approach from my great sports psychologist I was working with at the time, Katie Warrener. And she kind of helped me see that you can give every bit of yourself to the performance. And if the result doesn't go your way, you can forgive yourself and move on. You don't have to feel terrible. And in fact, if you give yourself to the performance, that's the reason why you don't have to feel terrible. In fact, that's what gives you the allowance to to feel okay and to move on. And there's some work to do around it. It's not just that kind of that message, but actually just hearing that for me was quite profound. So that's the message I try and give on with this virtue to other athletes, is what I heard far later. I mean, if I'd heard that message as a 17, 18-year-old, I think I would have saved myself a whole lot of grief. And probably, and what I found was my performances started improving because I was relieved of that kind of immense anxiety and fear of what happens if I lose. Suddenly there was no backlash. If I lost, it was going to be okay. And so my performance was just I could be far more focused on the here and now, and my performance improved. So this is a classic example of something that's generally considered soft in traditional kind of sport culture, which ends up being both incredibly healthy for me. I relieved of so much grief and verging on depression for days and weeks afterwards, and improved my performances no end. So it really kind of it fits this philosophy that we're talking about. The healthy kind of well-being approach can be incredibly powerful for the performance as well.
For me, my experiences, Laurence, on, let's say, the golf tours, or working with tennis players who play the ATP or the satellite tours, my experiences, let's say, in football clubs, soccer clubs, there's so much intensity and tension, and quite a degree of unhappiness in these environments. So what you're saying really resonates with me. I think the challenge for athletes and coaches is this notion of, well, if I'm self-compassionate, does that mean I don't care? Because I have to care, because ultimately I've got to go out and compete and compete well to be able to play in the team, to be able to stay in the team, to be able to win money, to keep my tour card, or whatever it might be. And you addressed this slightly at the end of what you were saying there, in terms of, well, actually that self-compassion piece, when you learnt that as a fencer, it actually paradoxically perhaps enhanced your performance. And that feels like that bit of mental gymnastics that athletes and coaches have to try to engage in, to be able to understand that actually being compassionate with self can improve learning, improve performance, actually improve outcome.
Yeah, absolutely, and it comes hand in hand with some other bits of work, which is perhaps a bit more kind of classic sports psychology work around kind of focusing on the process of your performance and your values around the performance. So if you know those things, you realize those are the only things that will help improve your performance. So the self-compassionate piece, that's another tool that helps you get your mind back on track of, like, what's the process here? What do I need? What's my game plan? And that's what I found anyway, was that freeing up that mental energy that I would usually waste on, oh God, what if I lose this? What's going to happen? What are they going to think about me? I'm going to feel terrible. All of that energy was just kind of was dropped to the side to allow me to focus more on my game plan, my values, and what I was going to do here and now.
I love what you've said there, because I think we can talk about self-compassion, but perhaps in that performance environment, we do have to focus our attention, don't we? We do have to compete with intensity. We do have to execute actions with a positive intent, or just execute actions positively. And that, as you've mentioned, that popular word, process, that probably requires a process. And that's where we can potentially invest our energies, which is more adaptive because it's more controllable. However, you do also introduce to the reader ways to be able to develop self-compassion, and you introduce to the reader notions of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, which may stem from the work of Kristin Neff. Would I be right in saying that?
Exactly, yeah. She's the kind of foremost researcher in self-compassion. And when I first started kind of looking into this, I wrote a few blogs about self-compassion, researching. I found her work, and I was already a kind of huge proponent of mindfulness, and the True Athlete Project, that mindfulness runs all the way through as kind of a core of all of our work. So I was really kind of happy to see that she split self-compassion into these three parts: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness being one of them. So self-kindness is just about kind of treating yourself as you would a friend or a close family member, and everyone can kind of picture how they would respond to their teammate or their brother or sister or mother who was suffering, who'd made a mistake and was suffering. They would immediately be kind and forgiving and warm to them. And it's about doing that to yourself. And common humanity is about recognizing that mistakes and failures and losing is all part of the common human experience. That's what makes us human. So when we're suffering, when we make the mistakes, I remember this very clearly. When I lost, I felt like I was alone in this. Like I was the only one who was suffering like this. In this particular way, it was just me. But actually, a recognition that every athlete, every top athlete, has been through this whole process as themselves. They've made mistakes. They've embarrassed themselves. They've felt fallen completely flat on their face and gotten up and carried on. It can be incredibly kind of helpful when you're in that moment to recognize this is just a normal part of the athlete's experience. And then mindfulness is essential. It's kind of the foundation of self-compassion, because you need to be aware of your own kind of inner dialogue and inner space in order to treat yourself with kindness and recognize this common humanity. So mindfulness sits at the heart of it, just to recognize, to see what's happening inside of you.
And then, Laurence, importantly, you actually in the book, you address the common concerns and the misconceptions that people have about self-compassion, that it's soft or that it might undermine some kind of motivation to work hard and keep improving. And I suppose that comes back to the mental gymnastics that I spoke about earlier. I do think that having been a professional sports person myself, a coach, and probably been and having lived in that world, not just as an athlete, but admittedly as a coach, thinking that one had to think all or nothing, or be all or nothing, behave all or nothing, and define one sport in an extreme manner. There's a lot of work that coaches need to do, and a part of that is understanding that this isn't about some soft approach to play and competitiveness. That it's not saying, well, don't be motivated towards excellence. I love that you've included this in this part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that many people, when they hear the term self-compassion, have their own kind of perspectives on it and their own understanding of what it would mean, and how it's not quite the right thing for athletes. So it's important to take those head on. And the research, there's some amazing research that shows just how kind of resilient and strong self-compassionate approach is. So they found that the military veterans who were suffering from PTSD, the level of which PTSD they were suffering from was in relation to their level of self-compassion. So higher self-compassion means lower PTSD, irregardless of the level of combat that they'd experienced. So it's this kind of this forgiving, allowing, kind of accepting approach to the self, which actually provides an incredibly strong foundation for resilience, and for even at the very kind of most extremes of emotion and psychology, like post-traumatic stress syndrome. It can really kind of help provide this strong foundation. But yeah, there are loads of other examples, and my own was just this, that it freed me up. It just kind of, it gave me the space on which to focus on the things that I wanted to focus on, rather than those things that were just distracting me and frustrating me and sapping my energy. So if we want our athletes to focus on what do I need to do now, and be clear about that, and really kind of go to task on it, then this is the approach we need to teach them, not the beat themselves up for 3 minutes, lose focus, get frustrated, finally get your mind back on track. Now what do I need to do? No, right from the beginning. Okay, I made a mistake. That happens. I'm okay with that. What do I need to do right now?
Do you think one of the hurdles to overcome, I mean, as we speak, Laurence, the Euros are going on, and this episode will be released post the Euros, so we'll know what the outcome will be. But I watched a game last night, and I suppose if you were to sum up the game in one word, you could probably sum it up. You could probably use the word passion. And do you almost think it's the narrative that players and coaches have is driven by words like passion and strength and aggressiveness, and that sometimes feels like the addictive nature of sport or the entertaining value of sport, that it sort of teases extreme emotions. So when we start talking about self-compassion, it almost feels like a difficult sell, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But isn't it so wonderful to see this kind of the breath of fresh air that Gareth Southgate is showing in his leadership, and the kind of it feels like he's breaking new ground in leadership at that level of kind of on that stage. And I'm sure you've seen the meme. We're talking about self-compassion now. This wonderful meme that's just gone around of Gareth now hugging Gareth, who just missed the penalty
Yeah.
in Euro '96. Talk about self-compassion. That shows it. But Gareth Southgate shows in all he is. He shows a compassion to his own team, but also to the opposition players. I think that the photo of him hugging himself, that was him hugging a Colombian player from the World Cup when we just knocked them out. Actually, it was cut from there. So he really exhibits this kind of what would traditionally be thought of as these kind of soft elements, but to get amazing performance benefits.
I think that's really well said, Laurence, and I'm pleased you brought up Gareth Southgate, because I think, and as I say, this will be released post Euro, so we'll know what we'll we'll have spoilers by then. We'll know what will have happened, so people will be listening into this and go, well, this is what happened here. But the feeling I get right now, when we're on we're actually recording on the day of the semi-final, England against Denmark. And you're an Englishman living in Denmark, so it's of double interest to you. And you married a Dane, I believe.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what a household you've got tonight. Really exciting stuff. But the sense I get, I love this conversation, because the sense I get from the England camp right now, no matter what happens, is that we are putting in an enormous amount of energy and effort into this. We're passionate about striving to perform and to high perform and striving to win, and we want to. We want to high perform and to win, but it won't be the general feeling I get, Laurence, is it won't be the end of the world if we don't. That and that's okay. That there's more at stake here. There's the human side. I mean, there's a lot of we're at the back end, let's say, of COVID in Great Britain, and there's lots going on in the world, as there always is. But the way that Gareth has led the England team, utilised his staff to cooperate in leading the England side, to lead in servitude to the players, often. It feels like that the result, as much as we want result, it's not the end of the world if we lose. And if we retain the same intelligent, pragmatic approach, if we do lose, we'll go again. We'll go again next week. We'll go again next month. We'll go again next year. And because there's not that necessarily that extreme emotion there, we give ourselves a better chance to high perform and to win. And if we don't, it's not going to be ripped up and started. Everything's going to start again. We carry on going, doing the right things, have the right intelligent processes in place. That's just my thoughts on that one.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree, and I think that Southgate's leadership and the letter that he wrote to the nation before these championships, they're it's just the best example of what I think the true athlete, our philosophy stands for, what we're all about. I think he absolutely recognizes what the true value of what they're doing is, what the real meaning of being there is. It's not just can they win this match, can they go one match more. It's far beyond that. It's about it's these human elements. It's about the connection between the players and the connection between the team and the country. And I think he's just he's living out every bit of what I think this philosophy is made to do. So it's wonderful to see.
After you address compassion, you move on to integrity. Interesting. Can you speak to us a little bit about the importance of integrity?
Yeah. So I mean, integrity comes at various layers and levels. There's an integrity which is kind of that you have a certain, your kind of core self doesn't change too much in different contexts. Obviously, you do change your behaviors, but there's some core that stays the same. There, I also go into kind of integrity more at a system level. So the integrity of clubs not cheating, and of corruption at the highest level of sport, kind of federations, FIFA, and like the impact that the lacking integrity in the sports system can have. So I kind of approach it at different levels. Coming back to, I spend a bit of time on the issue of diving in football, because this is what actually brought us together in a Twitter conversation, and I it probably influenced why I chose that as an example. And again, bringing back to the Euros, we saw Immobile, this video of Immobile rolling around like he'd had his foot cut off. And the Italians a few seconds later scored, and he kind of sheepishly looked up and jogged off to, like, it wasn't a thing. And I don't kind of lay it all on footballers and diving, but I point to that as an example of kind of the loss of meaning around integrity and kind of honor and sportsmanship in sport. And I think diving could be snuffed out in football in no time flat, either by the organization, the kind of UEFA, FIFA, or by the clubs, or by the players themselves. Anyone, any stakeholder could do it. Um, and I think it's just such a shame when you see that from Immobile, and you know how many kids are watching that and thinking that's something that you can do in sport, is just pretend and you're cheating, basically. I mean, there's no other way of saying it. It's cheating to try and get a free kick or a penalty. That that is taking us further away from the value of sport and the meaning of sport, in my opinion. So this idea of integrity, of it's living up to our values, and that links to the mental emotional strategy of knowing your core values and knowing how to live by them.
Yeah, and I'd like to address the values things. Just, if I may, just to challenge you fractionally on what you've just said, or just to frame a question back at you. I suppose from a cultural perspective, what is deemed to be cheating in one culture could be deemed to be perceived as a cunning method to win in another. And ultimately, human beings, their behaviors are heavily influenced culturally. So I suppose, um, doesn't this depend on how much empathy we have for human behavior, and human behavior being driven by their culture, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, you're quite right, and I wouldn't lay this at the feet of the individual. And Immobile is a, a product of culture, and it's not on him that I want to jump on. And I bring this example. It's a fascinating example that I came across. Actually, it was one of your other guests, Stu Carrington, who introduced me to this, about the Maradona hand of God incident. That on the one side, for the English, was this kind of travesty of sportsmanship, and how could this possibly be? How can they be proud of this? But because of the culture of kind of Argentinian football and this idea, it was right after the Falklands War, where the Argentines were completely dominated by this massive superpower. That cheating to get a goal was seen 180 degrees differently. It was kind of getting one over this kind of rich superpower and winning sneakily by whatever means possible, getting away with it, was seen completely differently in these two countries. So you're absolutely right that to frame it in those references, but this also comes back to, well, do we not need a shared understanding of what the point of this is, a shared understanding of the meaning or the values that we're going after? And there is lots of that. I mean, there is lots that we can agree on within sport that is kind of in common, but I would come back to the kind of powers that be, those who organize and set the rules. Most things need to filter down from there. If they decided diving is not something that we want to stand for, then there would be changes happening, and culture would catch up with that.
Within this chapter on integrity, it feels like, and you've mentioned values, it feels like, or you feel that values are very important, not just to integrity, but multidimensionally. They underpin behavior in many ways. I mean, do you feel that every athlete would benefit from sitting down, having a conversation, thinking about writing down their values in order to help them manage their behaviors on a day-to-day basis, to manage their motivation, to manage their performances?
Yeah, without doubt. I mean, it's one of the exercises that I did when I was preparing for the London Olympics, which has kind of reverberated longest and most powerfully in my life since then. It's in sport and out. So, and I've heard that we do these value exercises with lots of our athletes in the True Athlete Project, and also I do it with the fences I work with. And every time it leads somewhere kind of really interesting and meaningful for the athletes concerned. So even if I mean even if it's not the thing that is going to change their life, it's always something of value to them. I mean, it really is something that I think in the most cases it's eye opening. In probably 80-90% of the times I hear an athlete who's worked on it, they say this was something I really appreciated doing, and opened their eyes to. It ties back into this kind of idea of what you're in it for, and both the meaning, but also how do you get the best out of your performance? Because once you have your values, you can start thinking about how am I going to live them in my sporting life. And that brings your attention back to what can I do here and now, the good stuff, the process stuff, and allows you to see what I kind of noticed. This revelation for me was that win, lose, or draw, whatever the outcome is, if I've tried to stay to my values and to my game plan, that didn't change. It didn't change me. It didn't make me a worse person. It didn't make me a failure if I lost the match, because I had these things that I was working on, and my values didn't change. Who I was as a person didn't change because I lost a match.
It has a real self-awareness and self-control piece to it, doesn't it, Laurence? It's when you sit down and you write those values, it gives you a better opportunity to understand self, and then subsequently, I mean, what is self-awareness for? Ultimately, it is for self-control. To then be able to align your values with your behaviors, or notice when your behaviors are out of sync with your values.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what living with integrity basically comes down to: is, are you living in sync with your values, or are you out of sync with them? And that causes, everyone knows deep down, if you're living out of sync with your values, it causes immense kind of inner turmoil and turbulence. It just feels awful, and it can go to a really dark place if you're too often living outside of your values.
The next virtue you talk about is responsibility, but it's not just responsibility for self. It's not just for your own journey. It's for that of your community as well, which is an interesting, I suppose, expansion on how we usually define responsibility. We usually define responsibility around self, don't we? So I love what you've done there. Can you speak to us a little bit about this virtue, this chapter?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I do point to the bits where you need to take responsibility for your own journey, your own development, and those kind of standard things we hear. But another key kind of core element of the True Athlete project kind of vision and philosophy is that everybody has a responsibility to make a positive impact in the world around them, however big or small. And athletes tend to have a raised platform to do that. I mean, even kind of younger regional or even club level athletes, they have younger athletes looking up to them in the club. They have teammates that they can impact. They're just all the way up to these kind of global superstars, the LeBron James, Marcus Rashford, who have immense platforms to make kind of an immense contribution. So it brings us back to this idea of what can sport be? What do we need sport to be in society these days? And that's the kind of question we keep coming back to: what does society need from sport now? And we're saying that we need athletes to stand up for kind of the things they care about. Ties in with this kind of this move towards kind of player power and taking the knee and kind of standing up for issues they care about. We need them to take responsibility and to recognize the platform they have to do that. And I think Marcus Rashford, I mean, sometimes it's not helpful to speak about the kind of global icons and the difference they can make, because most people are not like them. They don't have millions of followers. But just because it was such a wonderful kind of example of this, that he forced the government through campaigns, personal campaigns that he kind of spearheaded, to do 2 U-turns on providing free school meals for kids in the UK, underprivileged kids. And it's something like 1.5 to 2 million kids received free school meals or free meals through the summer, and then again the following year, because of the campaigns he made. And it's, I mean, when you think about what can sport be in the world, what better example than that of an athlete, a young athlete who's recognized where they've come from and realized this is something I can make a difference in, and going out, kind of setting himself out, educating himself about it, and going to task and making just a massive difference to real people, to people's lives, completely away from the football pitch.
It feels like the message in this chapter is living a life of agency meaning to take charge of oneself, essentially, to attribute misfortune on oneself rather than always blaming others from a very basic perspective. Living a life of agency and living a life of meaning, but getting that meaning, a sense of fulfillment from your actions within your community, within society, not just, okay, the meaning of this is to win the gold medal for me or to win the championship for me. It feels like that you're suggesting that well-being, welfare, the enjoyment of the pursuit is enhanced through activity within the community.
Yeah, and just to kind of, what always brings this so kind of like to bear for me is running this mentoring program. We have these wonderful Olympic, Paralympic, elite kind of athletes coming to us as mentors, and so often we hear that they spend a lot of time. They meet kind of very regularly for kind of throughout the whole year work. They do a lot of preparation for these sessions, and we hear so often from these mentors who are, some of them are retired, some of them are still competing at the top level, that this work that they do, kind of giving back and helping a younger athlete on their journey, is some of the most meaningful parts of their life as an athlete. That they really feel like they're getting more out of it than their mentee is, perhaps, and it just highlights that, yeah, I mean, you can absolutely do that alongside your sport. And if we're a bit more aware of where the real meaning of it is, it comes back. You have to give back. You have to contribute something, and that's it's not just about making massive kind of countrywide campaigns and forcing government U-turns. It's about doing small things, kind of helping a young teammate, or mentoring, or whatever it can be, just in your club or in your local community. Those end up being the most meaningful parts of your entire journey.
There's a final virtue that you speak about, and that's to grow your awareness of the present moment and of what truly matters in life. Tell us a little bit about this. I'm going to assume that by introducing this chapter as what truly matters in life, you're potentially going to suggest that whilst the gold medal is important, it's not life and death.
No, exactly. And so again, this virtue, I kind of aim it in different places. There's awareness of the present moment, and this is also in a very practical sense. If we want to perform well, we need to be kind of really present. I mean, it links to flow and being absolutely in the zone. Is awareness of that, as Viktor Frankl put it, the space between kind of the event and your response to it is where our power lies. So mindfulness is an absolute essential kind of training tool for growing that awareness of that space and your ability to control that your response, and then kind of zooming out to what really matters in your journey as an athlete. And I think it's so important to do that kind of reflection. It will help you in so many ways. It will help you stay in your sport and deal with the setbacks and challenges that are necessary. Again, it ties into resilience. And what I talk a bit about in the book is my experience of kind of going through a long career in sport and having friends in fencing who were Olympic champion, multiple world champions, all the way down to guys who were on the circuit for many years without getting anywhere near those results. And all of them finished their careers in some just a little bit dissatisfied with what they've achieved, thinking that they could have done a bit better. The world champion wanted to be Olympic champion. The Olympic champion wanted to defend their title. And but actually, the things that they're talking about, that they remember, that they really valued, at the end of their career, they look back on the relationships they created, the experiences they had, the places they visit. They're very rarely kind of, yeah, they've got some nice memories of those top victories. I do as well. I think about them every now and then, but really what I think back of as I value is those kind of the relationships, the connections, and those experiences, the personal growth. And that, I guess, that's another key part of this book is the sport is about, it really can develop the individual in incredible ways. It's almost unmatched in society for developing, because of the kind of challenge and constant kind of pressure that is involved in elite sport. It can develop the individual to places that most other activities can't. And just let's help our athletes grow that awareness of what really matters. So they don't spend 10 years laser focused on that one gold medal, which they could potentially achieve or not, and feel bereft afterwards.
And which often takes them further away from that gold medal.
Yeah.
Now, and I think, to finish off today, let's speak a bit to part 3, because I think there's this interesting juxtaposition here whereby a lot of the book you're talking to the reader about the importance of broadening meaning to strive to enhance the experiences athletes have and coaches have to, yes, not just give them a better chance to high perform and to potentially win, but also to broaden the meaning, the experience they're having, and the meaning of participating in sport. But even you'd admit, and you've suggested this at the beginning of this conversation, that there still needs to be skills in place that enable us, not just technical, tactical and physical skills, but also mental skills that enable us to pay attention in the moment, under pressure, compete with intensity, compete with positive actions, and also to deal with failure which inevitably arises. And as you mentioned earlier, I think that part 3, the emotional strategies that are important, it very much revolves around stoicism. Take us to finish off today, to finish off this conversation. Tell us a little bit about this part 3 and a bit more about the approach you take here and stoicism.
Yeah. So actually, there are two kind of major influences on these strategies. Stoicism is one, and there's elements around. I mean, the controllables is one of these mental emotional strategies which comes directly from Stoicism. Gratitude is a Stoic kind of approach, but actually Buddhism also kind of influences quite a lot of this. So mindfulness is the first mental emotional strategy on the list, and is a deep dive into that because it really is just, it ties together all of these virtues and so many other, as with self-compassion, it forms the foundation of self-awareness. And you raise your awareness of what's going on for you, you can then layer on top these other things that we're talking about. So that's the first. Self-compassion is a very Buddhist kind of concept. So there's these two strong influences, but then I've also been kind of very influenced by sport and positive psychology. So what I tried to do here, okay, some of the things that people will be very familiar with, working with your values, and to an extent mindfulness and the athlete identity. There's a lot of awareness of kind of the damaging effect of being entirely wrapped up in an athletic identity and what happens when things go wrong. So that there's those elements, but there's also, the parts of our approach in the Triathlete Project, which are somewhat countercultural, somewhat non-traditional. So the idea of using gratitude and love, for example, kind of there's a heavy focus on love versus fear, and how you can increasing your love for your sport and your teammates and even your opponents can be a performance advantage. This was an approach I was inspired by a rower, a Canadian rower turned coach called Jason Dorland. An amazing approach there. Embracing vulnerability is another kind of area concept that I feel like, much like self-compassion, there's just this huge misconception in traditional culture and sport culture around. Many people now are familiar with Brené Brown, who's kind of been this rock star researcher in around vulnerability and has done mega TED Talks. But so I was kind of translated that into the sporting context, and this understanding that, so just to jump quickly into that, Brené Brown talks about vulnerability being a state of emotional insecurity or emotional uncertainty, risk, and emotion exposure. That's it. And if you think about a sporting performance, there's uncertainty about the result in every case. There's an emotional exposure on the line because you care about it, and anything you care about, you're exposing your emotions. And then there's a risk to your ego based on that emotional exposure. And so any sporting performance, therefore, is a kind of an exercise in vulnerability. And yet we kind of expect, and we look up to these top athletes who seem to just be uber confident and have no struggles, and they're just dealing with it. And it's not the case. It's unhelpful and it's not true. So raising a bit of awareness about, especially for young athletes who might believe that if they have doubts, or if they're struggling a bit, or if they're anxious, that's wrong, that they're doing it wrong and they'll never make it to the top. This kind of awareness raising around vulnerability can be super helpful. And I tell this story, I think I told you, I wrote to you a little while back about this example I had from the Rio Olympics, when I went to, just before our competition was about to start, I went to the toilet, and in the cubicle next to me, I heard somebody violently throwing up. And I thought, God, this guy, whoever that is, they're in for a poor guy. I came out, washed my hands, and out came one of the Italian team members. And I thought, oh, he's not going to have a good day. So the day continues, and this guy goes on and wins the gold medal, his first ever victory in a major tournament. And
yes.
it was just an immense bout of nerves, of competition anxiety that caused that in him. But he dealt with it. He understood. He'd prepared himself to be ready for this. He's going to be uncomfortable. It was vulnerable, and he performed anyway. So that kind of section kind of lays bare this misconception we have about vulnerability, that everybody wants to be brave and courageous in performance, but no one wants to admit their vulnerability in it. and one doesn't come without the other. You have to embrace the vulnerability in order to meet it with courage, and there's some things that we can do to kind of prepare for that. And much in the way that you're an advocate for kind of having a mental framework for athletes, this can absolutely tie in. There's so many ways you can prepare for these moments when you know your emotion is going to be high, your ego is going to be at risk, it's going to be trying to protect itself, and meeting those moments with courage, you can prepare for those situations, and it can be immensely powerful.
And as you were speaking there, I was about to say, I don't think that you can compete on pitch or on court or on course in a mentally skillful manner without having the opportunity to express vulnerability, to talk about the negative thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations that you experience. And I also off the pitch, the court, the course, it's very difficult to enjoy thinking flexibility if you're not given an opportunity to express vulnerability. And absolutely, I'm an advocate of mental skills frameworks, but I'm also an advocate of the optimal way to incorporate those into environments. And one of those steps for me, I mean, a couple of nights ago, I delivered a presentation to coaches and talked about 7 steps to incorporating mental skills frameworks into your coaching practice or your environment or your organization or team. And one of the steps is giving players the platform to express vulnerability. I just think it's imperative. I just cannot see, Laurence, how one can be mentally to optimize their mental skill frameworks or to optimize your capacity to be mentally skillful without vulnerability. Because if you just bottle it all up and say, well, I can't do that because I'm an elite athlete or because there's no room for this, it will all come spilling out at some stage, or it will come spilling out often. And your capacity to be mental skillful is just, I'm not going to say it never appears, but I think it lessens your chances.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, mate, it's such a great book, and I think we spoke about this a little bit off air. Is that it's a challenging conversation to have in sport, because sport is so loaded with talk of outcome and high performance, and sport can be so extreme, language can be so conducive um, to use in elite sport. And so, the book that you've written is a challenging book to write, but I think you've really brought it alive for the reader. And I think that, the topics are spot on. And I think it will be a read that everyone will enjoy. I think it will be a read for some that will be easier than it will be for others. And I think it will. You're always going to get people on the on the extreme ends of continuums, but I think for those who are perhaps have been historically socialized into X's and O's and wins and high performance, and I understand why they have, and I've been there myself. I think this is a resource that will help them, that poses questions, and gives them tools and techniques, philosophies, viewpoints, approaches to look at it slightly differently. That would be my experience of reading it.
Yeah, well, I completely agree that it will be easier for some than others. And I would just say that, I mean, this is not just a kind of idealistic approach. This has been tried and tested with athletes of all levels and coaches who are also initially very resistant. And I would just say, try it out. If there's something you think doesn't seem right, try a little bit of it and see what the response is. Because yeah, we've noticed that the athletes get it. When a coach who's initially resistant just gives it a go or is open to us working with the athletes on it, the athletes get it so quickly and they respond incredibly positively. And if you're a coach that's trying that, it's just there's nice feedback that comes when you try some of this stuff out. And the book is kind of aimed at, it's aimed as a philosophy for athletes, but I do kind of mention that for this, I mean, an essential part of this, I know you're a big one for kind of the psychologically informed environment, and if we're going to help athletes live some of this kind of philosophy, this kind of approach, it requires the coaches and the leaders to facilitate, to be aware, and to think about what's the environment that we need to create if we're going to have these virtues: integrity, compassion, awareness, responsibility in our athletes.
It's the ideal book to guide psychologically informed environments. Absolutely. Laurence, how can somebody listening in get hold of a copy? I'm assuming it's available through all normal channels, and I know you will have tapped the interest of the listeners. How can people follow you and get in contact?
Yeah, so the book will be published on the 20th of August and will be available everywhere you normally find books. Definitely get in touch with me on Twitter at Laurence Halsted. Check out the trueathleteproject.org website. This is all of the stuff I talk about in the book we're working with. We have kind of programs for, and by all means get in touch. I've connected with so many of your past guests, and it's something I really appreciate about your podcast. It kind of allows me to feel at the forefront of so many of these topics. So I'd be happy to hear from anybody who wants to get in touch.
I'm delighted to be a super connector, mate. Well, Laurence, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It's just a pleasure, as always, to speak with you. So thanks so much.
Yeah, lovely conversation, Dan. Thank you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.